The first time I truly understood what kind of man my brother had become was the night he tried to trap my girlfriend in our parents' kitchen. Until then, I had always dismissed his behavior as arrogance, cruelty disguised as humor, or the kind of selfishness that our family, for some twisted reason, had always excused. But that night at the wedding reception, what should have been an ordinary family gathering, Richard crossed a line that can never be erased. The moment Sarah walked into the room, I felt it. That sickening shift in the air, the way Richard's eyes latched onto her like she was prey. He practically shoved our mother aside just to get to her first, stretching the embrace so long that I saw Sarah's shoulders tighten in discomfort before she had to pull herself free. The entire dinner that followed became a grotesque performance, my brother's relentless attempts to assert himself at my expense. He laughed too loudly at jokes only he seemed to find funny. He brushed against Sarah's shoulder, her arm, her back, under the flimsiest pretenses, all while spinning ridiculous stories that painted me as some pathetic shadow of a man. He told a fabricated tale of how he once rescued my high school girlfriend from my supposed emotional abuse. A complete lie. I could see Sarah's polite smile faltering as he spoke, but she said nothing. She already knew the truth from the conversations we'd had about my past. Still, my parents just sat there, nodding along as though Richard's words were scripture. And then he went further. At one point, he actually tried to feed Sarah from his own fork, his stare so direct and unsettling that I clenched my fist beneath the table. Sarah, ever gracious, declined with a soft laugh, but I saw the way her eyes darted to me, silently asking how much longer she had to endure this circus. She wanted to make a good impression. It was her first time meeting my family. She didn't want to cause a scene, but her fingers trembled as she adjusted her napkin, and I hated myself for not dragging her out of there then and there. After dinner, things took an even darker turn. While I was in the garage with my father, shifting dusty boxes stacked high against the wall, Sarah volunteered to help my mother in the kitchen. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Something inside me twisted when I realized she hadn't returned. When I stepped into the kitchen, the sight that greeted me nearly sent me over the edge. Richard had her pinned near the sink, one hand braced on the counter by her hip, his body angled too close. His voice, low and insistent, was dripping with poison. "You deserve someone more exciting than my boring, unstable brother." Sarah's eyes found mine instantly. Relief flooded her expression, but her body trembled, her back pressed against the counter as though she had nowhere to escape. She had already told him to back off twice, she whispered later. Twice. And still he loomed there, smirking, pretending it was all a game. When I stepped forward, Richard's only response was to laugh. Sharp, mocking, as if the entire scene were some elaborate prank only he understood. I wrapped an arm around Sarah's shoulders and she leaned into me, her breath unsteady, her skin cold. Richard's laughter rang in my ears long after we left the kitchen, the sound of a man who knew he could do as he pleased and face no consequence. But I also knew something had changed that night. Sarah and I had been together for 8 perfect months, building something strong, something real. And yet with a single evening, my brother had begun tearing it apart with his obsession and cruelty. What I didn't know then, but would learn soon enough, was that this wasn't the first time Richard had crossed lines like these. It was simply the first time he had done it where I could see. Our family had always cared more about appearances than truth. Raised in a wealthy Minnesota suburb, my parents built their entire lives around image. Success in real estate had given them money, but it had also hardened them, turned every dinner into a performance, every holiday into a competition. They didn't want a family, they wanted a portrait of one. And Richard, the golden child, the charming younger son born just 3 years after me, fit their portrait far better than I ever did. From childhood, he learned that cruelty could be disguised as charisma, that lies told with confidence could pass as truth, and that our parents would defend him no matter how far he went. That night, watching Sarah tremble in the kitchen, I understood that the boy I once shared a room with had become something darker than I ever imagined. And it was only the beginning. Would you like me to continue rewriting part 2 in the same style, maintaining the pace and layering in? I thought my parents had already reached the peak of their cruelty, but I was wrong. What came next felt like betrayal sharpened into a blade. When Sarah tried once more to defend herself, her voice trembling but calm, her hands gripping the stack of printed texts and saved voicemails like proof of her own sanity. They didn't even let her finish. My mother waved her off as if she were a child, insisting she was too emotional and reading too much into things. My father muttered something about how men will be men, and Richard sat smirking in the corner like a king watching his loyal subjects obey. Then my mother did something so grotesque I can still hear her voice. She suggested a therapist, not for Richard, for Sarah. She said it with that soft, poisoned tone she reserves for gossip. Sweetheart, I know someone wonderful who specializes in young women who create drama out of nothing. I'm sure she could help you. Sarah froze. For a moment, she looked like she'd been slapped. I saw her trying to stay composed, explaining once again the harassment, pointing to the messages, the voicemails, the evidence. But my parents talked over her, dismissing her words as if she were invisible. And then Mark, one of Richard's friends, a man who should never have been anywhere near my girlfriend, smirked as he described in perfect detail what Sarah had worn on different days at work. Every shade of her scrubs, the color of her hair ties, the brand of her shoes. He thought it was clever evidence. My parents nodded gravely as though this stalking proved that she was trying to attract attention. That was the moment the air left Sarah's lungs. She started to hyperventilate, her hands trembling so violently she could no longer hold the papers. And when I stood to follow her out, my mother grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and hissed, "It's time you choose. Your real family, or a girl who is unstable and trying to destroy us." I chose Sarah. Of course I did. We walked out that night, and I haven't spoken a single word to them since. But leaving didn't make it stop. Richard's friends grew bolder, whispering poison into the halls of Sarah's workplace. They spread rumors that she was mentally unstable, that she had a history of false accusations. They painted her as a hysterical woman who ruined reputations for sport. It didn't matter that none of it was true. Gossip stains faster than truth ever can. Her supervisor called her in. He seemed sympathetic, even apologetic, but the words still cut deep. All this drama was affecting her performance, and perhaps for her own peace of mind, she should consider transferring to another department, or another hospital entirely. By then, Sarah was breaking. She cried before every shift. Meals went untouched. The girl who once laughed so loudly it filled entire rooms had lost weight, her face hollowed out by anxiety and exhaustion. I held her as she sobbed in the dark, whispering she was sorry for being weak, while I clenched my fists at the ceiling, wishing I could tear down the entire rotten structure that was my family. We hired a lawyer. We began the slow, grinding process of restraining orders, affidavits, police reports. But justice moves like molasses, while cruelty spreads like wildfire. A former colleague of Sarah's offered her a lifeline, an opening at a hospital 300 miles away. She's been considering it. I told her I'd follow her anywhere, but inside I hated that we were being driven out of the life we had built, because no one would protect her. I kept telling myself, it can't get worse. It can't. But then came Amanda's wedding. Amanda, my cousin, one of the few in my family who had always seen through Richard's mask. She was the only one who remembered the day she caught him torturing her cat as a boy, the only one who hadn't let our parents gaslight her into silence. She had written a statement for our lawyer, outlining Richard's history in detail. She believed us when no one else would. When she sent the wedding invitation, Sarah and I hesitated, but Amanda called us herself, promising that Richard was only on the guest list because her parents insisted. She swore she had hired extra security to keep an eye on him. She even placed us at a table with her husband's family, far from my parents and Richard. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Maybe surrounded by witnesses, watched by professionals, Richard would have no chance to pull his usual stunts. Maybe we could attend a family celebration without fear. The ceremony was flawless. Richard, busy playing the role of groomsman, kept his distance. I let myself breathe. But peace with Richard never lasts. And that night at the reception, the nightmare began again. At first, it seemed almost normal. We sat at our assigned table with Amanda's in-laws, safely across the reception hall from my parents and Richard. For the first time in weeks, I watched Sarah begin to breathe without fear. She laughed at something Cynthia's aunt said, sipped champagne, even allowed herself to smile. A real smile, not the tight, careful one she had worn for so long. For a moment, I almost believed we'd made it through the night untouched. But Richard never allowed peace to last. Around 9, Sarah excused herself to the restroom. 10 minutes passed. Too long. I glanced across the room. Richard's chair was empty. The hairs at the back of my neck rose, a silent warning my body recognized before my mind could catch up. I stood and started walking toward the hallway that led to the bathrooms. That's when I heard it. Sarah's scream. It was sharp and strangled, slicing through the muffled music and chatter of the reception. My chest seized and I broke into a run. Ahead of me, Cynthia and his brother turned the corner at the same time. What I saw next will haunt me until the day I die. Richard had her pinned against the wall, his body pressing her down as if she were prey trapped beneath him. One of his hands clamped over her mouth, the other crushing her arm so tightly that angry purple bruises were already blooming on her skin. Her shoulder strap was torn, her eyes wide with terror as she thrashed beneath him. "Get off her!" Cynthia roared, tearing him away with a force that rattled the wall. His brother, a police officer in another city, shoved himself between Richard and Sarah as I reached them. Sarah stumbled toward me, trembling so violently I could barely keep her upright. Her breath came in ragged sobs. Her dress hung ripped at the shoulder, and her arms bore the marks of Richard's grip. I gathered her into my arms, her tears soaking my shirt, while Richard, drunk and wild-eyed, began shouting accusations into the hallway. "She's been teasing me all night," he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "She followed me here. She wanted this." It was a grotesque inversion of reality, and for a second I saw him for what he truly was. A man so warped by entitlement and delusion that he believed his lies could overwrite the truth happening in front of dozens of witnesses. Cynthia's brother immediately called the local police. Cynthia himself guided Sarah into a private room, where Amanda and her mother tried to calm her shaking frame with blankets and hushed reassurances. I stayed in the hall, my pulse pounding, as Richard stumbled back and forth like a caged animal, alternating between rage and pathetic sobbing. When the officers arrived, the scene exploded into chaos. My mother lunged forward, shrieking that it was all a misunderstanding, insisting Sarah must have led Richard on. My father went further, actually trying to block the officers as they attempted to cuff my brother, his voice booming about how this was a family matter. Richard, red-faced and sweating, swung wildly between hysteria and menace. One moment he was wailing about how Sarah had seduced him. The next he was spitting venom. "You don't know what I'm capable of. None of you understand." His voice cracked with fury, his body thrashing as they forced him into the back of the squad car. And then, as if he couldn't leave without searing one final wound into the night, he screamed through the open window that Sarah was nothing but a whore who had been begging for it since the first day we met. His words, slurred and dripping with hate, echoed across the parking lot. Several guests, phones raised, recorded every second. His downfall was caught on camera, unfiltered and undeniable. But my parents weren't finished. They spun out of control in the days that followed, calling relatives one by one, twisting the story until their version was as grotesque as Richard's. According to them, Sarah had lured him into a secluded hallway, made advances on him, and then cried assault when he rejected her. They painted her as a schemer bent on revenge, a manipulator who orchestrated the entire spectacle to humiliate Richard. I wish I could say their campaign failed, but lies spread like wildfire when fueled by desperation and pride. The family fractured, some siding with the truth they saw with their own eyes, others retreating into my parents' delusion. And through it all, Sarah sat silent, clutching my hand, her body trembling every time she remembered the weight of Richard's hand pressing her into that wall. It was over. He was in handcuffs. But somehow it felt like the war was only beginning. Richard's breakdown in that hallway should have been the end of everything. He cycled between weeping theatrics, claiming Sarah had seduced him, and snarling threats promising none of us understood what he was capable of. His eyes were glassy, wild, the mask finally ripped away for everyone to see. When the police finally forced him into the car, he unleashed one last torrent of filth, shouting that Sarah had been asking for it since the first day we met. Phones were raised everywhere. Guests recorded every word, every violent twitch of his face, every venomous accusation. The entire meltdown spread among the family within hours, proof that could never be erased. But if I thought evidence would silence my parents, I was a fool. The aftermath has been brutal. My parents launched a campaign of denial so desperate it bordered on delusion. They called anyone who would listen, twisting the truth into grotesque lies. Sarah had supposedly lured Richard into a secluded corner, seduced him, then cried assault when he rejected her. According to them, she was a vengeful liar, orchestrating a plot to punish Richard for exposing her. They even had the audacity to claim she bruised herself and that Cynthia and his brother had roughed Richard up before police arrived. But this time, they couldn't bury the truth. Amanda's wedding video caught Richard trailing Sarah toward the bathrooms, his focus predatory. The footage, combined with Sarah's bruises, multiple eyewitnesses, and the recordings of Richard's arrest, created a case so strong even our lawyer sounded relieved. Several guests came forward offering statements about Richard's crude remarks throughout the night, the way he shadowed Sarah across the reception hall like a shadow he couldn't control. Cornered, my parents turned their venom on me. They threatened to disown me unless Sarah dropped the charges. The calls and texts poured in, some laced with guilt about destroying the family, others cold threats about cutting me from my inheritance or making sure I never worked in this state again. The worst was when they appeared unannounced at my apartment. My mother collapsed into sobs so loud the neighbors called the police, wailing that I was sending her baby to jail. My father, red-faced and trembling with rage, promised to ruin me professionally. They stood there, blocking the doorway, avatars of everything toxic I had been raised to accept as normal. That was the moment Sarah and I made our decision. She accepted the job 300 miles away. I arranged to shift my role to remote work. We would leave at the end of the month, no matter the cost. Some might call it running away, but for us it was survival. We needed a clean start, a life not poisoned by my brother's shadow or my parents' endless enabling. Amanda promised to keep us informed about any family developments, her loyalty unshaken. Still, the hardest part was the realization that nothing would ever make my parents admit the truth. They had seen Richard assault someone in public, in front of witnesses, and still they clung to the fantasy of his innocence. Even now, they defended him and blamed Sarah. Sometimes I wonder what might have been different if someone had intervened when we were children, when his cruelty was just beginning to surface. If anyone had stopped him then. But those questions have no answers. All I can do is move forward. So we packed, we built, we started over, and for a time, life was quiet. 4 years passed in silence. Sarah and I married 2 years ago in a small, intimate ceremony. Amanda stood proudly beside us, her family and Sarah's gathered, while the rest of mine remained conspicuously absent. We bought a modest house in our new city, filled it with warmth and the promise of safety. Sarah flourished, rising to head pediatric nurse at her hospital. I was promoted to senior developer working remotely but finally feeling secure. And now, with our first child on the way, a little girl due in 3 months, our life felt whole in a way I had never thought possible. Which is why the phone call yesterday felt like a ghost clawing its way out of the grave. I was in the middle of a meeting when my phone lit up with my mother's number. I ignored it, then ignored the second call, the third, the fourth. Normally, she changes numbers whenever she wants to bypass my silence, but this time she left a voicemail. Her voice was so frantic, so broken that I called back. She was sobbing so violently I could barely make out her words. Between gasps, she finally choked out the truth. Richard had gotten married last year, to a woman none of us had ever heard of. Her name was Angela, and something terrible had happened. I shouldn't have been surprised, not after everything, but hearing my mother's sobbing voice recount what had happened, I felt both vindicated and hollow. After the wedding disaster, Richard vanished from my life. Apparently, he resurfaced in a church community where he met Angela. Their families arranged the marriage quickly. My parents thrilled to parade their son as a redeemed man, a good Christian husband with a dutiful wife at his side. My mother gushed on the phone about how perfect Angela was, how happy Richard seemed, how finally he had found someone who understood him. For a moment, she almost sounded proud, like she believed all the blood and bruises had never happened. And then came last week. Angela's coworkers noticed she hadn't shown up for 3 days. Concern turned to fear, and one of them finally called the police. Officers did a welfare check. What they found nearly made me drop the phone as my mother babbled through her tears. Angela was lying in bed, battered nearly beyond recognition. 2 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, bruises crawling up her arms and down her legs. The officers rushed her to the hospital, and when they pressed for answers, the whole rotten truth spilled out. Richard had started hitting her barely 2 months into the marriage. Every time she threatened to leave, my father stepped in, not to protect her, but to shield his son. Using his real estate connections, he leaned on her family about their mortgage, threatened her job security through his business partners, whispered poison into her parents' ears about her being unstable. The same playbook they used on Sarah, recycled without shame. The last attack came after Angela earned a promotion at work, a step toward independence Richard couldn't tolerate. His rage boiled over. He beat her so viciously she couldn't get out of bed. When she called my father for help, he told her to put ice on it and remember her vows. That was the moment her coworker stepped in and saved her life. Now Richard sits in jail again, charged with felony domestic violence. And this time, my father sits beside him, arrested for witness intimidation and conspiracy. My mother begged me to come back, to stand by them in a time of crisis. She wailed about loyalty, about how family must stick together. She even had the audacity to claim Angela was exaggerating, just like she said Sarah had. I lost it. Years of restrained anger poured out. I told her, in words that burned my throat, that she had enabled Richard his entire life, that she chose denial over accountability when he tormented me as a child, when he humiliated me at every family gathering, when he cornered Sarah at Amanda's wedding and tried to destroy her. I asked her if she ever once thought about what her protection of Richard cost the rest of us. Did she realize that if they had sought help when he was a boy, if they had held him accountable even once, maybe Angela wouldn't be lying in a hospital bed now? On the other end of the line, my mother broke completely. She admitted they had always known Richard was different, that they thought covering for him was keeping the family intact. She sobbed that they should have done something sooner. But her confession rang hollow. Too little. Far too late. I hung up. I blocked her new number. Later, Amanda filled in more details. Angela's parents were devastated, horrified that they had believed my father's lies instead of their daughter's pain. Now they are firmly at her side, urging her to press charges against both Richard and my father. Police are investigating further, and several of Richard's ex-girlfriends have already come forward with stories of stalking, threats, and abuse. He left a trail of broken trust and fear wherever he went. Sarah suggested we reach out to Angela through Amanda to let her know she isn't alone. I had you, she reminded me softly. She might not have anyone yet. She's right. If there's any small good to come of this, it's making sure Angela knows she has people who believe her. Some might call me cold for cutting my parents off, but I've learned that enabling monsters only creates more victims. My family had chance after chance to stop this, and every time they chose silence, appearances, and denial. Now, at last, they face the consequences of their choices. Without me, my duty is no longer to them. It's to my own family, to Sarah, to the daughter we're about to bring into the world, and to the peaceful life we've fought so hard to build far away from their poison. And for the first time, I feel certain I've chosen right. Cutting contact with my family was the hardest decision I've ever made, and the best. Every day since has only proven it was the right choice. Last month, Amanda and her husband drove down to meet Nicole for the first time. Watching them cradle her, smiling with unguarded joy, I realized what family is supposed to feel like. Not duty, not guilt, not the suffocating pressure to protect monsters, but love. Real love, given freely. Meanwhile, the rest of the family saga unravels without me. Amanda has kept us updated since she still maintains limited contact with the wider clan. Richard, in the end, took a plea deal. 8 years in prison for aggravated domestic violence, parole possible after 5. 8 years of bars and concrete where his charm, his lies, his smirk can't touch anyone. For the first time, he's facing consequences that can't be spun away with family money or excuses. My father's case is still grinding its way through the courts. His lawyers are scrambling to negotiate a deal, but his real estate license is already suspended, and most of his partners have cut him loose. Watching his empire crumble must feel like punishment enough, though I doubt he'll ever see it that way. The biggest surprise has been my mother. After our last conversation, the one where I told her the truth she'd avoided all her life, she finally broke. According to Amanda, she started therapy. She's moved out of the family home. She even filed for divorce. Last week, I received a 12-page letter in her familiar cursive. An apology for everything. For enabling Richard's cruelty. For ignoring the torment he inflicted on me as a boy. For standing by while he tried to destroy Sarah. She admitted what I've always known, that she and my father raised Richard into the monster he became by never holding him accountable. Part of me wanted to burn the letter unread. Another part wanted to clutch it like proof that I hadn't imagined all those years of silence and complicity. I read it, and though I can see the sincerity, it's too late. Where was this insight when Richard was torturing animals as a child? When he stalked Sarah? When she screamed at Amanda's wedding and my parents defended him as if the truth were invisible? Sarah and I have talked quietly, late at night, about whether one day we might allow my mother a supervised relationship with Nicole. But if it happens, it's years away. For now, distance is safety. Angela, meanwhile, has become a quiet thread in our lives through Amanda. She's recovering, living with her sister in another state, committed to therapy, finally free enough to file for divorce and cooperate with prosecutors. She's stronger than she knows. Her parents, once complicit in silence, have transformed. They cut ties with my parents completely, apologized publicly to Angela, and now work with domestic violence organizations to help others recognize abuse. Out of tragedy, they're trying to build something better. The wider family is fractured. Younger cousins and relatives stand with us and Angela. The older generation clings to excuses, muttering about loyalty and appearances, the same poison that destroyed us all along. Amanda's mother, my aunt, started a family therapy group for those who want to break the cycle before it consumes another generation. And us? We've chosen peace. Sarah returned to work part-time last week and was promoted to director of pediatric nursing. I'm still working remotely, but I'm considering starting my own consulting firm. We've built a community here. Friends who feel like siblings, neighbors who feel like family, people who know how to love without conditions. Sometimes late at night, I think about my mother's letter, about whether healing might ever be possible. But then I look at Nicole's sleeping face, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the promise of her future. I remember that if I had stayed, if I had given in, my parents would have expected me to bring Richard back into her life one day. They would have insisted he deserved another chance. That thought alone is enough to silence the doubt. The cycle ends here, with me. Nicole will grow up surrounded by people who respect boundaries, who understand love without cruelty, who know that forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the truth. She will never have to unlearn the lessons I grew up with. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do for your child is to cut the rope tying you to the past. Even when it hurts, especially when it hurts.